Hi there, this is Mike from Green Vigilante Media. Today we're here with Green Party activist and candidate Howie Hawkins. Howie, thanks for talking to us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. No, thanks for having me.
Excellent. We're here to talk about the Green New Deal today. We're getting a lot of media attention for the Green New Deal. But let's go into your background a little bit, Howie. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be an activist and ultimately to the Green Party?
Well, I came up in the San Francisco Bay Area, 50s and 60s, so civil rights movement and then the anti-war movement. And really 1964, I'm 12 years old, and Ronald Reagan's running around California trying to get the fair housing law we just adopted repealed. He was successful that year. That was before he was governor. That's the Republicans. So I said, well, they're racist. What about the Democrats? They got these Dixiecrats in the South. You have the Freedom Democrats challenging them from Mississippi, and the Democrats sat the segregationists. So I'm 12 years old asking, where's my party? I later learned John Lewis made that same statement at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. So I'm looking around and, you know, watching the adults screw things up, escalate in Vietnam, not really come through on racial justice. And the Peace and Freedom came along, Peace and Freedom Party. So I'm 14 now and turning 15 during that registration drive telling adults, you got to register in this party so you can vote against the war. And they're telling me, well, why are you worried, son? And I'd say, I don't want to get drafted. I don't support the war. And they said it'll be over by the time you're old enough to be drafted. Well, I got drafted and the war was still going on. So I've been interested in independent progressive politics since that time. I really consider the Peace and Freedom Party the first green party in the world. They had a platform. It wasn't just conservation, it was ecology. And they talked about the relationship between how human society is organized and what we're doing to the environment. And it was rudimentary compared to thinking today, but it was a start. And I stayed active with that. People's Party, 1972, Ben Spock, the baby doctor for president. Barry Commoner, 1980, the Citizens Party, which the German Greens called the Green Party of the United States. But the year of their last convention in 1984 in St. Paul, Minnesota, they were having their last convention when we had the first meeting to form a Green Party. And I actually went over to their convention Saturday night. They were partying, see, you know, what they were up to. And I've been involved in the Green Party since then. So that's how I really got involved. It was the 60s and the issues of civil rights and peace, and also the environment. I mean, I was an early Sierra Club guy, and I left with David Browder for Friends of the Earth. And, you know, I watched the sprawl march down Silicon Valley and destroy the orchards that used to be there and wondered, can't we do better?
Wow, excellent. And you were a very strong advocate for labor during your activism as well, right?
Yeah, I worked construction in my 20s, 30s, and 40s, and I was a Teamster in my 50s and 60s. And well, late 40s and 50s and 60s. So, you know, I was concerned about my own issues, active in my local and the Teamsters, Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And I could go through, you know, labor struggles going back to the farm workers' grape boycott, you know, back in the late 60s and 70s.
Right. So inspired you to run for office then? Just all of these issues that you were advocating for?
Well, I basically was drafted to run by local Green Party here in Syracuse, New York, for city council several times, mayor a couple times. And then as the state party got organized, I was put on the state ticket for comptroller twice and now governor for 3 times. So, and U.S. Senate against Clinton in 2006, you know, 3 issues, life and death issues, the war in Iraq, single payer health care, and climate.
Right.
And so that's in each case, really I was asked to run, except one. I ran for Congress in 2008 because I felt the Green Party needed to that was the most prominent race in the Syracuse metropolitan area. And it took a while to persuade the local, but when we finally did it, I think it really helped us raise our profile and raise the issues. And that was an interesting election because that's when the financial crash hit, the financial collapse of the housing market.
Right. And I see that you came close for city at large councilor with 48% in what's that, 1993?
No,
Or go ahead.
2011.
Oh, 2011.
Yeah, I got 48%, 96 votes. It was a district race.
Uh-huh.
And I got over 40% in that race twice. So yeah, came close.
Right. And then you also ran a pretty good showing for city auditor as well for 35%.
Yeah, that's right. That was 2015.
Yeah, excellent. So what brought you to advocate for the Green New Deal? Can you tell us a little bit of history on that?
Well, actually, I was just today looking back at the Green Party USA platform from 2000, which I was the principal drafter of. And there's a plank in there for a global Green Deal, saying that rather than making enemies with our military interventions, let's be the humanitarian superpower of the world, as Ralph Nader was saying at that time, and fund the UN Development Fund project to provide basic needs to everybody in the world, which was at that time $40 billion needed, according to the UN Development Report, a fraction of our military budget. And along with that, make investments in what we call ecological production. We were dealing with toxics as well as climate change. Climate change didn't have a high profile. So this has been in the air among green politics for a long time. And then in 2010, when I was asked to run for governor of New York, I said, let's call for a Green New Deal. And a lot of Greens at first were resistant. They said, oh, New Deal, that's the Democrats. They didn't even really complete it. We're referring to Franklin Roosevelt's last State of the Union address, where he called for a second economic bill of rights, where everybody would have the right to a living wage job or an adequate income, decent housing, comprehensive health care, and a good education. And on top of that, and this is post that, the Great Recession, the financial crash, to get the economy going again, we do a massive public investment in conversion to clean energy. 100% clean energy by 2030 is what we stated at that time, based on a study came out in 2009 by Mark Jacobson out there at Stanford, and one of his colleagues at UC Davis that said the whole world could go that way. It was technically and economically feasible by 2030, and it was in Scientific American. So that's where we started. And it was important to us to link the economic justice to the ecological conversion or energy transition. And the lesson there was going back to the 60s, when the Black Freedom Movement realized they were going to win formal civil rights with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and hopefully the Fair Housing Act. They saw a white backlash developing. And so A. Philip Randolph, who was the principal instigator of the March on Washington in 1963 for jobs and freedom, said, we're going to have to liberate our white brothers and sisters in order to liberate ourselves, because the backlash, was based on fear of competition from Black workers primarily. And the way to deal with that was to make sure everybody had a good job. And so that's where they were talking about jobs and this whole economic bill of rights. And to me, we have the same problem today. I mean, in the last election in Colorado, they rejected restrictions on fracking. In Washington State, they rejected a carbon tax. What triggered the Yellow Vest movement recently in France was a gas tax. And it's not so much those people are opposed to dealing with climate change, but why are you picking on us, the working class? So, and I know this from having been in construction industry for 30 years, workers feel like a job is a bird in the hand versus two in the bush you're talking about with clean energy. So they'll build anything that gives them steady work. And they're distrustful of experience with so-called transition programs like NAFTA. There was trade adjustment payments to workers who were displaced by NAFTA. And in fact, my Syracuse region got the highest level of those adjustments during that NAFTA transition. And you talk to those people in their unions and it's like, yeah, we got something, but we ended up in a worse position than we were. So we got to have a real just transition that maintains income and benefits through the transition until people have comparable work. So to me, the economic justice piece is central politically to winning what we need to do for the climate action. So that's what we've been talking about in the Green New Deal. And now, of course, as you mentioned, it's blown up nationally. The Sunrise Movement sat in outside Pelosi's office, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, newly elected member of Congress from Queens, Bronx, and New York, showed up and said, I'm with you, and proposed a select committee on the Green New Deal. And while I can make criticisms of her whole proposal, the important thing to me was that she included not just the 100% clean energy by 2030, but the job guarantee, the income guarantee, and single-payer health care. And to me, that's the political package that is majoritarian, or we can build a majority around. Unfortunately, others, some of the environmental groups, Governor Cuomo here in New York, have reduced the Green New Deal to a green energy program that happens to create some jobs. And to me, that's inadequate and will be defeated politically or difficult. And then plus, they've watered down the goal. Just to take Cuomo, he wants 100% clean electricity by 2040. Well, 80% of our carbon footprint is not electricity. It's agriculture, industry, transportation, buildings. He has nothing for that. So it's not an adequate program. Plus, he's flooding the state. Even though we got a ban on fracking, we're importing frack gas for new frack gas power plants, which are being built now and will be producing greenhouse gases long after his goal of 2040 for 100% clean energy. So it's basically BS. So now we're, fighting in the state to get a real climate program and trying to get, our voice into the national debate, which I think is stalled. Pelosi's, taken this proposal for a select committee on a Green New Deal, which in the original proposal would have had subpoena power, the ability to put legislation on the floor. And now that's not happening. There's a climate special committee, and there's energy and commerce. And so it's all kind of fragmented, and, the establishment is in charge.
So that's interesting. I think one of the things that the advocates in the Green Party are worried about is that the different aspects of the Green New Deal are going to get corporatized or are going to be monetized in some way. Just like, for instance, advocates for single payer are worried that we'll get something that looks more like the Affordable Care Act, where corporations get more leverage and are a larger part of the deal than of course people on the left are advocating for. Do you see that with the Green New Deal, and how can we overcome that or resist that?
Again, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's original proposal said we should look at things like public banks to finance this. In terms of what it will do for private business, she's basically talking about contracts with public investments or loan guarantees from the public, which will be part of it. But I think a piece that is not in her proposal, has not been emphasized in most proposals, we've tried to talk about in New York, is we've got to have a public energy system. In other words, the major generation facilities and the transmission and distribution facilities, like PG&E out there in California. I mean, now that it's in bankruptcy court, it's an opportunity to take it over and run it at cost for public benefit instead of for the private profit of absentee shareholders. And when you have public ownership, you lower the cost of the investments because you're not paying profits to the absentee shareholders, and you're bringing it into a system where you can plan the transition without the obstruction from the incumbent vested interests of the utilities, the oil companies, the gas companies, and the new plant owners. So I think that has to be a central piece of a Green New Deal that is run for public benefit and doesn't just become a stimulus that's geared to making profits for contributors that then contribute to the politicians who keep reproducing that system.
Right. And also, early in your life, obviously, you were a anti-war demonstrator and activist. How about the military aspect of the Green New Deal, or the demilitarization aspect of it?
Well, the Pentagon is a major greenhouse gas emitter, uses lots of fossil fuels. In their strategic planning, they recognize climate change as probably the most important national security threat over the long run, because they see this is not just about, some heat waves and some more intense storms. It's about mass extinctions, ecosystem collapse, food production collapse, mass impoverishment, mass migration, and then civil conflict and wars for dwindling resources. And so this is why it's such a serious problem, and why, you know, as I said earlier, I like Ralph Nader's old idea. Let's be the world's humanitarian superpower. Instead of, you know, occupying the world with over 800 military bases, let's provide development aid. It's cheaper to win friends than enemies and fight them. And the global Green New Deal we were talking about back in 2000, we call it the Global Green Deal, I think should be part of that, which means, you know, we've got to have a strategy of arms reduction, cooperative security, where we, you know, go to our so-called adversaries and say, look, we're both spending a lot of money that we don't need to, and we have other needs. And our adversaries, quote unquote adversaries, have more needs than we do. I mean, Russia is a poor country. China has tremendous environmental problems and a demographic bulge, just to name the two big ones. India is another one, although they're not as armed. So I think that's a totally different approach than what we're doing now. And, you know, the Pentagon with all its military exercises is just burning fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. And there won't be a tomorrow if we don't get that turned around.
Right. Also, not to mention the humanitarian issue of war as well, and every military base is contaminated to the limit, to the extent of not being habitable after they leave. How about education? Is that something that advocates for the Green New Deal right now are emphasizing, like the Green Party is?
No, that is missing from the best of the Green New Deals outside the Green Party, which I would say was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's proposal. Doesn't mention anything about education. But that's a huge issue on people's minds. Student debt is now 1.5 trillion. The affordability of college is a big issue for middle income and low income families. And so the idea that we should have free public education from the Head Start preschool age 3 up to graduate school in public institutions is something that Bernie Sanders got a lot of traction on. It wasn't quite as full as I just described it, but you know, tuition free at public colleges is something that we had in a lot of states back when I was coming up. When I graduated from high school, I could have gone to, you know, UC or Cal State schools virtually tuition free. The City University of New York was tuition free from 1848 until 1975. I was in a debate yesterday with a Democrat in a legal women voters in a rural county of New York, and she said, it's not the American way. And I had to point out, well, you know, we did it for a long time. And so I think that's a popular demand. And like I said before, if we're going to get political support for the energy transition, we've got to let people know that we're going to take care of them along the way.
Excellent. And it sounds like in your activism, you were always aware of the racial tension in our U.S. and the difference in, you know, the way different races are employed, get income, differences in income. So is there a racial aspect to the, a racial equality aspect to the Green New Deal that you would advocate for?
Well, we talk about environmental justice and a just transition. And ethnic minority communities of color have been have borne the brunt of pollution. And, you know, example here in New York State, we have a community called Arbor Hill, predominantly Black, just off down in a hollow next to the state capitol, which is up on a hill. It's called Empire Plaza. And they have had a fossil fuel plant or a power plant there. First it was coal 100 years ago, and then they switched to oil midway through the century. Then they switched to garbage. And now the governor wants to switch to gas. And in the meantime, you know, that community has suffered a lot of respiratory illness and cancer. And that's what we call environmental racism. And that has to stop. And the Green New Deal, by talking about clean energy, it's not just clean for the climate, it's clean for our lungs. And, you know, one of the most polluted areas in the country is the South Bronx. You know, respiratory disease there is among the highest in the country. Los Angeles, where a lot of Black and Latino people live, another place where, you know, particularly car exhaust has created, you know, the smog, which is not as bad as it used to be, but it's still like debilitating, you know, for a lot of people. So that's a huge part of it. So that the investments we make have to be made in these communities that have been in the front line of the burden of pollution. And also then the just transition piece, which is for those workers in the fossil fuel industry, in the utility industry, in the nuclear industry, we got to make sure that they are made whole. And, you know, what we call a just transition today, I like the original phrase used by the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. Tony Mazzocchi, one of their leaders, championed this. They called it for a super fund for workers. At that time, we had a super fund that paid for toxic site cleanup when corporations didn't have the assets to do it. And he said, why don't we have a super fund for workers when they lose a job because of changes for environmental reasons? He also used the example of the initial peace conversion after World War II. And, you know, that was the GI Bill. So it was also called a GI Bill for workers. We need that for the energy transition. And it's basically maintaining income and benefits until you find comparable work during the transition. And so that's basically the whole working class, not just minority people that might be working in those industries. And the thing about the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, they have since merged into the paper workers and now the steel workers. But back then, they were dealing in the three most toxic industries: oil, chemicals, and atomic, the nukes. And so they knew what they were talking about. And they really wanted to get out of those industries. And that's what they saw this just transition program. So that has to be key to the Green New Deal. Again, or otherwise politically, we won't get the energy transition pieces passed.
Excellent. And what about electoral justice? Is that part of the Green New Deal that you advocate for?
Well, I know when, you know, after we campaigned for it in 2010, Jill Stein ran for president as a Green in 2012, and she used the theme Green New Deal, and she did put under there, after the Economic Bill of Rights and the energy transition, democracy. There were, you know, democratic reforms, democratic demands. And I don't have it in front of me, but, you know, it was things like public campaign finance, proportional representation, instant runoff voting for single offices like president, abolishment of the electoral college, and voting reform, so that we were moving into electronic voting at that time, and a lot of software was secret, and there was concern it could be tampered with and hamper the results or tamper the results. So all those were part of it. And it's not so much the way I've campaigned for a Green New Deal in New York. We sort of, you know, focused on the Economic Bill of Rights plus clean energy. But then we also had our demands for democratic reforms. You know, it's kind of more, at that point, it's a question of how you package it and present it, you know, what your themes are. So, but if we don't have real democracy, I mean, the only thing that's going to get us to this energy transition and these economic rights is a democratic movement where the people get to express their preferences. And what we got now is a plutocracy where money influences elections. Reformers are boxed in by big money. You know, the example there is Dennis Kucinich when he was the boy mayor of Cleveland back in the 70s. He ran on a campaign, I'm not going to privatize our municipal utility. And he got elected and he kept his promise. Not a lot of politicians do that. So the bank said, okay, buddy, if you won't privatize the utility, we're not going to roll over your line of credit. And every city needs a line of credit because taxes come in bunches and you got payroll every week and other expenses. And so they cut off a $13 million line of credit and put the city into bankruptcy. That's how capital exercises power outside the electoral arena. So that's why we need, you know, as we say, system change, not climate change. And we need it for democracy as well. Another thing that I think is relevant to bring up here is this recent study a couple years ago that they call it the oligarchy study, where some political scientists looked at issues where the public, they used the median income voter and the elite, which was the top 10%, had different positions in issues before Congress. And almost every time the elite won, despite public opinion preferences. So, you know, the things that we're talking about in this Green New Deal, take single payer health care, a national health program, that polls, you know, 60% and up. It has since Truman, and all through that period, but we've never got it. And that's because the biggest political problem we face in this country is that public preferences don't translate into public policy. And that's where the democracy demands come in and are so important.
Excellent. So you bring up a really good point. And I think a lot of Green Party activists and members are worried about. So the European Greens backed the Green New Deal in 2006.
Right.
You did in 2010, and Jill Stein ran on it 2012 and her 2016 campaign. So the Greens have been advocating for the Green New Deal for a long time, a long history of it. And now that it's going into more publicity, being adopted by other groups, the Democratic Party, do you think it has the ability to come out the other side in the spirit of the Green New Deal that the Green Party has advocated for? What do you say to those Greens that are worried that it's not going to be what they think it should be?
Well, they should be worried. I mean, the example I gave here of Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, he's using it just to brand his policy of flooding the state with frack gas. It's nothing. It's not what we're talking about with the Green New Deal. In Congress, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and 40 other members of Congress were for that original select committee for a Green New Deal. You know, not a perfect proposal, but a good one. And it's been defeated, basically. So I think what the Greens have to do is work with those progressive Democrats and the environmental groups that are pushing the Green New Deal. The Sunrise Movement is now trying to make it an issue of the presidential primary. So there are, you know, dozens of Democratic candidates. It's going to be debated there. What the Greens need to do is be out there with our own candidates saying, here's what the Green New Deal really is. And if the Democrats can do it, fine. But we don't think they can. And when they don't, the Green Party's here for you. And you're welcome.
Excellent. That leads me to my next question. With the publicity of the Green New Deal, do you think you as a candidate will have more appeal and it's a good time for you to run?
For what? I just ran for governor.
I know. Well, you know, people are announcing for president right now. You have a history with the Green New Deal. Is there something that you would consider running for, even as statewide or locally, just with the popularity of the Green New Deal and your history with it?
Well, I just retired, you know, from being a truck unloader, and I'm getting a little Teamster's pension, and I was going to try to do a lot of writing and organizing and help younger candidates here locally.
Sure.
But you're not the first person to raise that. In fact, there are a lot of serious people around the country. I feel like I'm being drafted like I was for Vietnam. But I have even less reason I don't have a good reason to say no. I guess I'll put it that way right now. I'm looking for one or another candidate that might carry the banner, but I guess I will say I am taking seriously people's requests that I take it seriously, and that's about where I'm at. But I would say whoever we run, they got to run on the Green New Deal and set the standard, and we'll see what the Democrats do. My guess is they'll come out with a social liberal economic conservative, which is, you know, Clinton type politics, but it'll be wrapped in a fresh wrapper like Barack Obama was. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of hope for change, but in the end it was, you know, he appointed Clinton to the State Department and then supported her for re-election. So nothing changed. And I think, you know, the Greens is going to be tough because progressives want, more than anything, as we do too, want Trump out of there. And Greens do better when the Democrats are in power because they disappoint progressives. So I think, you know, we just got to hold our head high, run on our banner, be positive, and be ready for the 2020s, because I think this climate crisis is really coming down on us. It has an economic impact. Living standards based on stagnant wages for the working class in this country have been stagnant for 40 years. It's frustrating to people. And in fact, the generation coming up is actually downwardly mobile. So there are a lot of issues there and the need for change, and we need to be ready for it. So that's about as far as I can say about the presidential thing.
Well, I'll just say that my question wasn't at all intended to put pressure on you. Maybe you're getting that pressure from other people, but it just seemed like connect the dots, you know, with the publicity of the Green New Deal. And like I said, your history with it, I think it might get us some extra publicity. And of course, we all, you know, like you as a candidate and admire your activism that you've done in the past. So thanks a lot for talking to us today, Howie. Are there any organizations you would like to promote, any websites that I could post up here for you so that issues and campaigns you might be working on?
Well, my campaign website, howiehawkins.org, has a lot of material that people would be interested in. And it links to my previous campaigns. So one of the websites, my 2014 governor website, long story, but it's not up. I'm trying to get it back up. So there's a lot of material there that people might find helpful. The platform material, press releases, news stories. I think, you know, that's for informational purposes. We have a Green Education Legal Fund nonprofit in New York, which one of the old Greens, Mark Dunley, he's devoting his whole life now to working on climate change. He was our candidate for comptroller, wanted the state to divest from fossil fuel companies and the state pension funds. I don't know, I think there's a Green Education and Legal Fund. There may be a website. I know there's good material that he puts out. I actually haven't looked at the website, but I would suggest looking there because they promote the Green New Deal in the NGO world.
Excellent. I'll look it up and I'll get that posted up here for you guys as well. Thanks a lot for talking to us, Howie. And good luck to you in anything that you're doing in your future, even if it's just some writing and enjoying your retirement, I guess.
Okay, great. Thanks for getting in touch.